For decades, Chuck Norris has stood as the symbol of American toughness. A real martial artist, a decorated veteran, and a man who climbed from nothing to become one of the most recognizable action stars in the world. That part is true and deserves respect. What he achieved, few others ever could. But that's only half the story, because behind every myth is a machine. And Chuck's image, invincible, unbeatable, untouchable, wasn't built by chance. It was engineered, carefully, deliberately, and sometimes deceptively. In this video, we're not here to tear down the man who earned his black belts and bled in real fights. We're here to talk about what came after. The matches that mysteriously vanished from his record. The uneasy tension between him and Bruce Lee that was never fully addressed. And the powerful forces in Hollywood that took a talented fighter and turned him into something he never asked to be: a living meme. A legend so inflated even he couldn't live up to it. This is the story of Chuck Norris, the man who earned our respect, and the myth that stole his truth. If you care about separating fact from fiction, about honoring what's real and exposing what's not, then like this video, subscribe to Punchline Scandals, and let's begin. Before he became a legend, before his name sparked internet jokes and Hollywood punchlines, Chuck Norris was simply Carlos Ray Norris, a boy growing up in a broken home in Ryan, Oklahoma. His father was an alcoholic who abandoned the family, leaving his mother to raise 3 sons alone in poverty. Chuck wasn't a natural-born fighter. In fact, by his own admission, he was shy, undersized, and painfully insecure. Bullied at school and overwhelmed at home, he had no idea that one day the world would see him as unbeatable. Everything changed when he joined the U.S. Air Force. Stationed in South Korea, Chuck encountered Tang Soo Do, a traditional Korean martial art. It didn't come easy. He struggled with coordination, failed his first tests, and lagged behind his peers. But he didn't quit. Slowly, through sheer determination, he earned his black belt and something more: purpose. When he returned to the States, he entered the competitive karate scene. This is where the Chuck Norris mythology usually begins. But what gets erased from most retellings is that he didn't walk in and dominate. In his early career, he lost, repeatedly. Fighters like Joe Louis and Alan Steen beat him in tournaments that no longer appear in Hollywood retrospectives. There were no slow-motion roundhouse kicks, no invincibility, just a young man getting humbled on the mat. These defeats were public at the time. They were documented, reported, and witnessed. But later, as Chuck transitioned into acting and became a household name, those moments faded. Not because they weren't real, but because they didn't fit the story being crafted. And Hollywood loves a clean narrative. By the mid-1970s, Chuck was marketed not as a man who overcame failure, but as a man who never failed. It was a subtle rewrite, one magazine profile at a time, one PR interview after another, until the version we remember had no room for weakness. The boy who once struggled to keep up in martial arts classes was transformed into a cinematic god who could destroy entire armies with a glare. But the truth is, Chuck Norris earned his skill. He earned his place. What he didn't earn was the myth. He didn't stay down. After the early losses, Chuck Norris pushed forward, sharpened his style, studied his opponents, and returned to the ring with a purpose few could match. In 1968, he captured the Professional Middleweight Karate Championship, a title he would defend successfully for the next 6 years. Unlike the fictional warriors he'd later portray, Chuck earned those victories the hard way, by bleeding, sweating, and refusing to quit. That determination that rise from nothing was the real story. But it wasn't the one Hollywood wanted. Because Hollywood doesn't sell real men, it sells symbols. Chuck's first on-screen appearances were humble, bit parts, martial arts cameos. But he had something that casting agents couldn't ignore: discipline, a square jaw, and an almost uncomfortable calm under pressure. And more importantly, he had connections. Among his karate students was none other than Steve McQueen, who saw star potential and urged Chuck to take acting seriously. It was a personal recommendation, not a talent scout, that pushed open Hollywood's gates. And once inside, Chuck found himself face to face with the machine. The producers didn't want the full story. They didn't want the struggling kid from Oklahoma or the young fighter who took beatings before he dished them out. They wanted the finished product, the champion, the warrior, the man who never lost. So that's what they made. Slowly, the narrative shifted. Magazine articles stopped mentioning his early defeats. TV appearances focused on his black belts, his victories, and his perfect record. Old footage disappeared from circulation. Writers described him as undefeated, and no one bothered to correct it. In this new image, Chuck's flaws didn't exist. His fights were effortless. His characters never broke. Every film reinforced the illusion Chuck Norris can't lose. And with each passing role, the real man faded further into the background. To the public, it felt organic, like Chuck was simply that strong. But behind the scenes, everything was calculated. Directors edited scenes to make his movements faster, his blows more lethal. Co-stars were told never to outshine him in fight choreography. And the scripts. They were written with one rule: Chuck doesn't lose, not even once. Not emotionally, not physically, not morally. It was around this time that the jokes began. Chuck Norris doesn't do push-ups. He pushes the earth down. When Chuck Norris enters a room, walls get nervous. At first, they were harmless. Even Chuck laughed. But over time, the myth took on a life of its own. The man who once struggled to master a roundhouse kick became a living exaggeration, a superhero in denim. And yet, Chuck remained grounded. He was known for his kindness on set, for respecting stunt crews, for treating young fighters with sincerity. But the machine didn't care. It needed consistency. It needed invincibility. And it needed silence about the past. When Chuck attempted to expand, taking roles that involved vulnerability or complexity, he met resistance. Studios weren't interested. They didn't want nuance. They wanted the man who walked through explosions without blinking. The man who never questioned orders, never doubted himself, never fell. And so, the legend grew bigger than the man behind it, louder than the truth it buried. Chuck Norris, the fighter, became Chuck Norris, the brand. But in building the illusion, something had to be erased. And that something was the truth. By the time Hollywood had finished shaping Chuck Norris into its steel-jawed warrior, another name had already carved a deeper impression into the global psyche: Bruce Lee. Where Chuck was precision, Bruce was raw energy. Where Chuck moved like a disciplined soldier, Bruce moved like lightning. They were opposites in style and philosophy, even in presence. And yet the two were destined to collide on screen and off. But what the public remembers about that collision is only part of the story. The rest was re-edited, rewritten, and in some cases deliberately buried. Their famous showdown in Way of the Dragon is considered one of the greatest martial arts duels in cinema history. In the film, Bruce Lee's character defeats Chuck Norris in a slow-burning, tension-filled battle inside Rome's Colosseum. It's the stuff of legend, two masters at the height of their powers trading blows with mutual respect. That's what we saw. But reality was far less tidy. Chuck Norris wasn't just cast as the bad guy. He was chosen by Bruce Lee, who admired Chuck's tournament record and saw in him a worthy on-screen opponent. Off-screen, they had trained together briefly in the late 1960s, but their philosophies couldn't have been more different. Bruce believed in fluidity, adaptability, breaking from tradition. Chuck remained loyal to form discipline and the structure of traditional karate. The tension wasn't hostile, but it was real. During the planning of Way of the Dragon, Bruce took creative control. He choreographed the entire fight. He set the tone, the rhythm, the outcome. Chuck had input, but it was limited. He was, after all, a guest in Bruce's film. And that imbalance quietly bothered him. Years later, Chuck would admit in interviews that he would have preferred a more even portrayal one, where both fighters walked away with dignity. But that wasn't Bruce's vision. And yet, Chuck played along. He showed up, performed professionally, and delivered one of the most iconic performances of his career, only to watch as the public interpreted it in ways that went far beyond the screen. Fans didn't just see Bruce winning a fictional fight. They believed Bruce was the superior fighter in real life, that he would have beaten Chuck in a real match, that Chuck had been humbled and exposed. The irony. At the time of filming, Chuck's competitive record was stronger than Bruce's. Bruce had never fought in full contact tournaments the way Chuck had. His reputation was built on demonstrations philosophy and raw charisma. Chuck, on the other hand, had won sanctioned titles, fought dozens of official matches, and endured real bruises in real competitions. But none of that mattered. The film decided the narrative, and Hollywood cemented it. As Bruce Lee's legend exploded after his tragic death in 1973, Chuck's role in his orbit became both blessing and burden. On one hand, their iconic battle gave Chuck international recognition. On the other, it locked him into Bruce's shadow. He was no longer seen as a champion in his own right, but as the guy Bruce beat, the man who lost in the Colosseum. Years later, Chuck would speak only respectfully of Bruce. He never tried to challenge his legacy, never attempted to rewrite the outcome. But that restraint came at a cost. Hollywood and the media had no interest in nuance. They wanted one clear winner, one clear icon. And Bruce, with his mystery, his tragic end, and his unmatched charisma, became untouchable. Chuck became the foil. Even as Chuck's own star rose in the 1980s with hits like Lone Wolf McQuade and The Octagon, the ghost of that fight lingered. Writers compared them constantly. Fans debated endlessly. And in the background, the truth remained inconvenient. The fight was staged, the outcome fictional, and the rivalry more complex than anyone dared to admit. But Hollywood doesn't sell complexity. It sells myths. And in the mythology, it built Bruce Lee was the dragon who soared, and Chuck Norris was the challenger who fell. Not because it was true, but because it sold tickets. Chuck Norris never asked to be a god. He worked to be great, but the image Hollywood wrapped around him became something else entirely. After Way of the Dragon, his career surged. The man who once stood in Bruce Lee's shadow now stepped into the spotlight on his own terms. Throughout the 1980s, he became a staple of American action cinema, churning out hit after hit, Missing in Action's Delta Force Invasion USA. The formula was always the same. Chuck walks in. Enemies fall, America wins. At first it was liberating. No more proving himself in dusty gyms. No more point-based tournaments. Now, Chuck was the hero on posters and lunchboxes on screen. But behind the scenes, the very myth that made him famous began to tighten its grip. Slowly, subtly, it became a script he could no longer escape. The problem wasn't just the roles, it was the rules. Studio executives had one golden guideline. When writing for Chuck Norris, he doesn't lose. He doesn't cry. He doesn't doubt. He doesn't question orders. He doesn't break. As his fame grew, the constraints grew tighter. Scripts were edited to remove any signs of weakness. Directors were instructed to keep his characters morally pure and physically invulnerable. If Chuck wanted to show range, to explore a different kind of man-conflicted flawed human, the answer was always the same. That's not what the audience wants. But it wasn't the audience making those decisions. It was the machine. The same machine that erased his early losses and polished his image into steel now dictated every beat of his career. He had become the embodiment of a fantasy one that left no room for complexity. Privately, Chuck began to feel the limits. He expressed interest in directing and telling stories with depth, even in playing characters who lose. But each attempt was quietly shelved or diluted. Studios were terrified of breaking the myth they had spent years building. When he starred in the TV series Walker, Texas Ranger, it was more of the same. A clean-cut, indestructible man delivering justice with his fists. It was successful. It was safe. And it was suffocating. Fans adored it. They didn't see the cage. But for Chuck, the legend had become a straitjacket. The internet only made it worse. In the early 2000s, Chuck Norris facts exploded into viral fame. Chuck Norris counted to infinity twice. The boogeyman checks his closet for Chuck Norris. What started as a joke turned into a global meme machine. His name was suddenly everywhere again, but for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't admiration. It was caricature. And yet, Chuck smiled through it. He played along. He leaned into the jokes, released books, made appearances. But the man behind the myth was fading. Few asked about his real philosophy. Few revisited his competitive legacy. Fewer still acknowledged that he had once been a struggling kid from Oklahoma who earned everything with grit, not gimmicks. Even when he spoke about serious issues, family faith politics, he was often met with smirks or punchlines. Because once the world has decided you're a living meme, it stops listening to your real voice. Chuck Norris had become too big to fail and too fake to grow. He couldn't break the image, and he couldn't evolve beyond it. And that's the quiet tragedy no one talks about, that a man who built himself through discipline and loss was ultimately imprisoned by perfection. Not because he chose it, but because the system demanded it. By the time the 2010s arrived, Chuck Norris had long ceased to be just a person. He was a cultural relic, a nostalgic punchline, and an internet superman rolled into one. Children who had never seen Delta Force could still quote Chuck Norris facts by heart. His face was printed on t-shirts, coffee mugs, even political banners. He had become a symbol, but a symbol of what? Was it strength, discipline, or just exaggeration? Somewhere along the way, the real Chuck Norris had been replaced, not by someone else, but by an image so amplified, so obsessively maintained, that even he couldn't keep up with it. He was respected, yes, but not for the reasons that mattered. Not for the blood he spilled in tournaments, not for the work ethic that transformed a bullied boy into a champion, not even for the self-restraint he showed when Hollywood turned his name into a marketing tool. No, he was admired because he had become a walking joke that people loved repeating. And the tragedy isn't that Chuck Norris became a meme. The tragedy is that the meme erased the man. He had tried to share his truth. In interviews, in memoirs, he spoke about his failures, his doubts, his faith. He discussed the toll that fame took on his family, the way the film industry flattened nuance into cardboard. But those moments were often ignored, overshadowed by the louder myth that had consumed him. Chuck Norris, the human being, flawed, thoughtful, and sometimes tired, was invisible behind the invulnerable mask. Hollywood had long moved on. The industry that once couldn't get enough of him now preferred younger, flashier, more ironic heroes. And when Chuck did appear, it was often as a parody of himself. A cameo, a nod, a wink, nothing more. But here's the thing. Chuck Norris never needed the myth. He had earned greatness the hard way through humiliation, through setbacks, through sweat. He didn't need invincibility to be respected. He didn't need to win every fight on screen to be admired. The truth, unpolished and imperfect, was already powerful. And yet, the machine that built him didn't trust the truth. It chose to rewrite it. And in doing so, it robbed him and all of us of something more valuable than any legend honesty. So what remains? A name? A brand? A carefully crafted illusion, or a man who deserved better than to be trapped in his own shadow? It's tempting to remember Chuck Norris as the guy who never lost, the one whose fists made the universe flinch. But maybe it's time to remember him differently, as the fighter who did lose, who learned, who grew, and who, at one point, tried to escape the very legend that made him famous. Because in the end, the greatest victory isn't about never falling. It's about being allowed to stand up as yourself and still be seen. We don't tell these stories to tear down legends. We tell them because legends, real legends, deserve to be known for who they truly were. Not the edits, not the slogans, not the sanitized myths. Chuck Norris was more than the meme, more than the muscle, more than the indestructible icon. Hollywood sculpted out of convenience. He was a fighter in every sense of the word on the mat in life, and within a system that wanted his image more than his voice. In a world obsessed with perfection, he paid the price for being too human behind the mask of invincibility. So if this story made you see him differently, if it made you question what else we've been sold as truth, then don't keep that to yourself. Like this video, subscribe to Punchline Scandals, and share it. Because behind every untouchable icon, there's a truth waiting to be told. And here we tell it.